Hello everyone, welcome to another monthly Patreon voted review where the patrons select the game, and this month's selection is Dimahoo by Raizing, rounding out the Mahou Trilogy. So we've covered all three at this point. We've covered Sorcer Striker, Kingdom Grand Prix, and now Dimahoo. And the first point we need to talk about when it comes to this game, because it is essentially required, is its relationship with Ikaruga. And so whenever people talk about Ikaruga, besides calling it a puzzle game, which I deeply refute, the other point about Ikaruga that comes up time and time again is, of course, its famous polarity system. When we talk about how fundamental the polarity system is to Ikaruga, everything around that game is built around that polarity mechanic. It is deep in the DNA of that game's design. But whenever people talk about it, there's always sort of this footnote that arises that says, well, actually, Ikaruga is not the very first polarity-based shmup. There was another that came out a year before, which is Dimahoo. And as interesting of a factoid as that is, I do think it is somewhat misleading, because the polarity system of Dimahoo is incredibly different than the polarity system of Ikaruga, where Ikaruga, like I said, it was completely the basis of that entire game's design. Everything revolves around polarity. In Dimahoo, it feels like Raizing were just throwing mechanics into the game, and one of the mechanics they came up with is, hey, what if we did some sort of polarity elemental damage system? But it's not so baked into the game's DNA that it couldn't be removed. In my opinion, it actually reminds me a lot more of the elemental typing system of Pokemon, essentially, where water does damage to fire type and electric type does damage to water type. That's basically the way it works in this game, where if you're in fire mode, you do more damage to ice people, and when you're in ice mode, you do more damage to fire people. But outside of that, there's like a few bullets that you cancel that are elemental, but they're not the majority of the bullets in the game. It just feels like they could have removed this whole system entirely, rebalanced the game a bit here and there, and had an essentially pretty close equivalent. So what I'm trying to say is, with Dimahoo, the polarity system is an extra flavor, but it's not a key ingredient like it is in Ikaruga. So I don't know if you necessarily need to keep bringing Dimahoo up as the first polarity shmup. I actually would not say so. I would still give it to Ikaruga just because it is so key to that game's design. So that's the first point about Dimahoo. The second thing about this game that interests me is the fact that it was developed on CPS2 Capcom hardware, just like Pro Gear. So in my mind, I sort of draw a little family tree between Pro Gear and Dimahoo, because it was during this time where I guess Capcom was approaching other shmup companies like Cave and Raizing and saying, hey, why don't you bring your shit onto our hardware? Of course, it wasn't long-lived, but I think it is a cool little era. And so even though Dimahoo doesn't have an official port that I'm aware of, and I do not consider these dumbass little mini console things official ports, you can still play it. It's still very accessible because of the fact it's on CPS2. It is incredibly easy to emulate. It has strong emulation. You could do it on the Mister. You could do it on Final Burn Neo. You could do it on MAME. It's just very well supported. So even though the game isn't officially released, I would still consider it pretty damn accessible. So Dimahoo. Where do I even begin? Reviewing these Raizing games is kind of like if someone took a photograph, they ripped it into 100 pieces, they stuck the pieces in your hand and said, here, you make sense of this. It's just this knot of tangled game design that is actually very hard to unravel and make sense of, because there's so many mechanics, different ideas flying around. Does this work? Does that work? It's hard to know where to even begin. So I decided this time around, I'm going to start by talking about what I think is the obvious strong point of all three of these games, which is the graphics, sound, and basic game design. So in terms of outside of all of the different systems and mechanics, Raizing really nail making the game look great with this kind of cute, quirky, sort of fantasy, but also sort of steampunk-ish art style that absolutely stands out. And in fact, I think that is the strongest force that ties these three games together. So that's still very strong here in this game. I think Dimahoo looks really cool. If I were to give a sort of ranking, my favorite looking one is still Sorcer Striker, and then after that I would give it to Dimahoo, and then my least favorite is Kingdom Grand Prix. But I think the graphics, the sound, the basic enemy layouts, the flow of the game design are all really solid. one of the main factors that keep people coming back to this game time and time again. I'm not entirely convinced that it is the systems of these games that make them popular. I think it's more that they nail the basics and make them work. And from there, they have their own kind of quirky flavoring with the systems. So you can't go wrong fundamentally picking up and playing the game. It's going to feel good. It's going to be fun. You have 4 ships on default, but of course, like many other Raizing games, if you put in a code at the title select screen, and you have to put it in quick, let me tell you that, you will unlock the other 4 ships, the guest ships, just like they do in Battle Garega, just like they do in Batrider. And it's definitely worth your time. There's some really cool guest ships in the game. Raizing has a kind of wild ship balance across their games, but this time around, it felt like, from what I could tell, most of the characters felt pretty viable. No one felt uber broken. Some were definitely better than others, but it didn't feel wildly out of balance like you can get in some of the other Raizing games. And so, how do you even play this game? I think that's the first question people are going to be asking. So the main mechanic you need to be aware of is the charge shot mechanic, where you need to hold down the shot button, and let me tell you, you need to hold it down a long ass time. This is not like Mega Man X where you charge for a second and fire. You're just holding that bad boy, and especially in a shmup, it feels honestly a little awkward how long that charge takes. And I think from character to character, the charges might take varying time. But I remember with Birthday especially, it took forever to get charged and fired. And it really gives the game an interesting quality and reminds me a little bit of Battle Garega, because in the early game of Battle Garega, there's a lot of sections where you just don't shoot, you just kind of hang out, and you're doing that to prevent rank. And in this game, you're holding it not because you're trying to prevent rank, but because you're trying to charge up the shot. So you're just sitting there, and you're just dodging bullets, moving around things, waiting for the shot to fire. But the reason why you want to use the charge shot, it is basically the essential way you do scoring in the game, and everything revolves around this, where you shoot the charge shot, it hits enemies, and then they drop items. And of course, being a Raizing game, there's a bajillion of these items, and it's confusing and complicated, and you need to go on to some kind of guide to even understand what they all are. I'm not going to cover all that in this review. I think it's way too tedious. So just know that you drop these items, and there's a shitload of them, and you have to collect them. But if you collect them in certain orders, they like go together in certain sets. And you can see these sets by holding down start, I think it is, and opening up this RPG-ish looking menu. But of course, it's all clunky, it's all awkward, it's not really all that intuitive. And watching super plays of the game and watching replays of the game, what's funny is that Dimahoo is actually not all that well documented of a game as compared to stuff like Battle Garega and Batrider, which have very extensive Wikipedias and breakdowns of how all the systems work. Dimahoo, it's a little bit more wishy-washy in terms of how things are going on. But what it seemed like looking at high-scoring replays is the meta of the game, the strategy of the game, all is around, in the early stages, you're just holding charge and you're just firing your charge shot and you're milking as much of these items as you can or as you need to route into these sets to power up your ship, to make scoring happen. And I think you do need to get a good amount of scoring to unlock certain extends and everything. So like many other Raizing games, scoring helps for survival, but not too much. And that brings us to the game's rank system, which like many other Raizing games is a little confusing and fuzzy. So if I get a detail wrong here or there, try not to hold it against me. Honestly, like I said, doing these reviews, it's like trying to study for an exam, but half the textbook is gone. You just have to kind of try and fill in the gaps yourself. But it seems like the way the rank in the game works is that the more you complete these item sets, of course, the more you're going to score, but also the more that's going to increase your rank. And so the way this works, I'll show a graphic here I'll come up with. There's like a bend when it comes to Raizing games, when it comes to scoring and survival, where if you play the game completely without any scoring in mind and you just play purely for survival, you're going to have actually a more difficult time in most of these games getting the 1cc, because doing a little bit of scoring and paying attention to the scoring system somewhat usually helps you along survival wise, gets you more resources, powers you up more, all that sort of thing. But the bend then goes upward, because if you start really scoring, if you start saying, okay, now I'm going to really go for a lot of scoring, like in Battle Garega, that cranks up the rank. So then it flips back around and makes it really hard again. So if you're going for a 1cc of this game, my advice is that you learn a little bit of scoring and you kind of put together a little bit of a route that gets you just enough to get you that extend and those extra resources, but not too much that it rises the rank up super high and you're battling uber rank like you get if you're going for a really high score. That has been my impression so far of how the rank system works. If there are any more clarifying comments, feel free to post them, but it did seem to me pretty in line with most other Raizing games in terms of how the rank worked. And the difficulty of this game I think is pretty interesting because, again, Raizing has this really unique quality when it comes to their game difficulty. They lure you in with a false sense of confidence. I've done this every single Raizing game I have played. They get me every time. Battle Garega, Bat Rider, Sorcer Striker. I didn't play Kingdom Grand Prix that much. I thought that game was crazy from the beginning. The way it works is you start playing and the game is like dumb easy in the beginning. You're like, oh, this isn't so bad. This is pretty easy. It's pretty basic. And for the first 3 stages or so, the game kind of lures you into this false sense of pure confidence. You're like one-shotting bosses. You're blowing the shit out of enemies. And you're like, come on, Raizing. What? You make this game for babies? And then stage 4, Raizing just kicks on the lever, like take your money mode, and it just gets fucking hard. That's what happens. And so it just goes boom, just this huge difficulty spike. And I think it's around stage 4, maybe stage 4 boss, the spider boss comes in, and all of a sudden the boss is like super hard and crazy. And then from there, the game just beats you down and is punishing. In terms of overall difficulty, I would say this game seems easier than Battle Garega and Bat Rider as far as getting the 1cc. But like I said, it's really hard to know for sure unless you actually sit down and go for it and grind out those hours. But it does seem an easier 1cc than those. So what do we even make of this game? How do I even evaluate what is happening here? So on the positive side, I would again say that the game is very inviting on the basics. So sitting down and just playing it and going for the 1cc, that is going to be a lot of fun. And you all are going to enjoy yourself in that process, like Sorcer Striker. It's very solid in that. From there, when you start pushing it further into like, okay, I'm going to go for some in-depth scoring, I'm going to take it to the next level, really dedicate myself to the game, that's where you need to have a particular taste. You need to look for certain things in order for this game to be enjoyable in that aspect. You can tell that Raizing was kind of throwing these mechanics and scoring ideas at the game, but it's not fully realized. And even the super player hero Jammers himself, when discussing the game's like, this is a little much for me. This is a little random and chaotic even for me. And so you need to be that type of player who just loves these really esoteric, odd, but unique scoring systems. So if you're like a Pink Sweets type person, if you like Sorcer Striker, you will like Dimahoo. It is in that line. I would say that, in my opinion, my favorites go 1, Sorcer Striker, 2, Dimahoo, and then 3, Kingdom Grand Prix. That's how I feel about the trilogy. But some people really like this game, and I think the polarity and the charge shot mechanic do appeal to a certain amount of people. For me, I don't like it as much because it feels really passive. You know, I'm not a passive type of player. I don't like to play shmups where I am just sort of sitting around and dodging things, waiting for my charge shot to fire up. And then there's a lot of boss milking that goes on for the items, and none of that's necessarily up my alley. But to me, they don't feel fully realized, fully fleshed out. It would be really cool if M2 did a port of Dimahoo like they used to do, and they went ahead and they made like a really coherent, interesting arrange mode, or they had a cool custom mode. This game would really benefit from stuff like that, like having a custom mode where you could set all the different parameters, turn off certain things, turn on other things. And I could see it really benefiting from a gadget system, of an item system that's easier to read rather than the crazy in-game one. Like, it could really benefit from that sort of treatment in the custom mode, like I said. But as it stands right now, these Mahou games are so unique. And it's not necessarily love or hate. It's more like you either love them or you never want to play them, but you respect them. That's kind of how it goes. And that is kind of my attitude towards the Mahou games. Besides Sorcer Striker, that one I do like to play quite a bit. But the other two, this one and King Grand Prix, I respect them. I respect what they're doing. I can see they're being creative, and there's a certain player subtype that loves this stuff, that loves cataloging all the different items and figuring out all the crazy quirks in the game system. but it's not quite my thing. I would just prefer to play Battle Garega. That's kind of what happens when I start to play games like Dimahoo. I'm like, maybe I'll just play Garega instead. But it is an excellent game. It would be nice if M2 did a port, but that list of games that would be nice for them to port is getting very, very big. And I don't really trust many other developers, certainly not City Connection, to port this game. So maybe it is best in the state it is right now. Still a really fun game to check out, but do not get misled. It is absolutely nothing like Ikaruga. So if you're an Ikaruga fan, I don't think you're going to really stick with this game in the same way. Thanks so much. Adios, everyone.
So thank you to the $5 patrons, 100, Dingo, Another Joe, Anthony A, Aaron Solis, B.Reality, Bo, Ben, Orgy22, Ryan Schiffer, Chris Yusufovich, Chronic Burnout 3, Climbing Coyote, Cook Some Soup, Corey Mark, Des Audio, Darren Griffin, Disco Stas Leia, DJ420 Praise It, Eric H, Fantaside, FCK, Full Set, Retro Shmupper, Hausu, J, Jason Allen, JLab, JBRPG, John Kelly, Gameboy Guru, K, K2, KZ, Khalil Reedy, Contain, Larridge, Malaise, Matthew Deragish, Maz, Megadeth 859, Minang, Megalyn, Michael Stum, Nichelle Y, Queen Charlene, Nathaniel Davis, and Electron, Neon Dagger Games, Ogla Googles, Philip Mason, Psycho Blizzard, Rattlecat, Raul, Real Skeen, Riv Mason, Robot Parking, Rolf015, Sarah, Scanline City, Seesaw FW, 7 Overdose, Shmup Junkie, Sarah Pong, Steve Fiction, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, TRM, Sugumo, Twilight EX, Utukoi Roots, Wappy Legs, and Utakaya. Thanks for watching.